So welcome back to 210, Ralph Waldo Emerson. This is a lecture on self-reliance, probably Emerson's most famous, actually not lecture, most famous essay. If anyone knows anything about Ralph Waldo Emerson, they know this essay, Self-Reliance. It's more frequently quoted probably than anything else he ever wrote, and a number of his most famous aphorisms come from this essay. Some of which have been used as epigraphs, as inscriptions on buildings, and so on. So you'll probably be familiar with some of the lines that you read here and have not known that they were from Emerson. So anyway, this is a very actually controversial essay. People have taken from it one extreme reading or another. There don't seem to be, at least in my experience, readings of this essay that are anything kind of less than extreme, saying either that Emerson calls for a really sort of radical kind of individualism, a kind of individualism that completely rejects social relations, or in some ways, a kind of individualism that fully embraces the social, tries to understand itself in relation to how to others. That is to say, that the individual needs to figure out a new way of working with others, not by abandoning them, but by doing something a bit differently. And so we'll talk about that. I would say there's a lot to say about this, and it's open for interpretation in a lot of different ways. Partly because Emerson is really he's really pulling out all the rhetorical stops here. He's really trying to charge up a reading audience. He's trying to sort of force Americans, specifically in this essay, as he did in The American Scholar, but more generally, to kind of claim their own heritage, to claim their own ideas, to claim their right to speak for themselves and understand themselves as they see fit. And we see that here, but there's a call largely for that can be generalized to a call for the need for an individual to think for him or herself and to make his or her own decisions about how to live his or her own life. It can sound really kind of simplistic in that sense, but remember that this is a kind of rallying call. This essay is kind of a call to arms, so to speak, sort of get up, start thinking, take control of your own life. So the claims here are in some ways extreme. Some of the sentences are extreme. They can turn people off, they can turn people very much on, but there's some extreme statements here. There's also a lot of tempering and a lot of sort of careful attempt to explain exactly how Emerson understands what the individual is and that individual's relation to the group or to society. So we'll talk about that. But the main point that I want to sort of make about this essay is that this is really, I think, Emerson's clearest and most forceful attempt to claim that a society cannot change. A group of people, the society cannot change unless its individuals change. So he does not believe that working from the group to the individual is the best way to go. He believes that the individual needs to change if the group is to change. So a friend of mine once said Emerson wants a society of individuals, which is a kind of, not sure if it's a paradox, but it's an interesting idea, right? A group that includes a number of different individuals that understand themselves as such on their own, yet somehow they're together, working together. But the point here is that Emerson believes that a society can be changed only if its individuals change. So I'm not going to argue, I don't think he's saying that the individual has a right to claim his or herself as if he or she exists in a kind of vacuum somewhere, gets to do whatever he or she wants. And again, the word there is want, which Emerson never uses. He never uses the word want. He always talks about need or musts, like should do's, duties, right? He doesn't say, here's what we want to do. He says, here's what we must do. Here's what we, here's what we need to do. Here's the duty that we have to figure out for ourselves. So the goal is always to find out what one's duty is, not how one can fulfill one's own personal desires or just fulfill one's need for pleasures or entertain oneself and so on. So again, the point here is that for society to change, the individual must change first. So, well, we'll move on. So he says on page 132, in the middle of the page, paragraph begins, it's easy to see that a greater self-reliance must work a revolution in all the offices and relations of men, in their religion, in their education, in their pursuits, their modes of living, their association, in their property, in their speculative views. So the idea here, this greater self-reliance, this new individual that we'll talk about, this idea of relying on oneself, is what will work and what must work, right? A revolution in all the offices and relations of men, in all of our social interactions, offices and relations, right? Our relations with others and offices, our institutions, our formal establishments that we set up, among one another or with one another. So he lists the various arenas, religion, education, and so on. And he will discuss these sort of, not exactly in this order or all of these, over the next several pages in points 1 through 4 that I won't review here. And we've seen him discuss these institutions and in other essays and sermons. And these other sort of forms of social relations. So the first is religion. The second he calls travel, the idea of traveling, what traveling is good for and what it might not be good for, and a particular kind of way of travel that is educational versus a kind of travel that's simply for entertainment or for fulfilling pleasures, right? The third is about education, and the fourth point is about, the social in general. What a society in general is and how it needs to work, and it needs to work from the individual out, he will say, as he has in every other essay and sermon and lecture that we've read so far. So the idea here, there's a greater self-reliance. So what is this self-reliance? What is it? Well, we're going to find him repeating many of the claims that we've seen him offer before. And there's going to be something of, well, a self-reliance is sort of making sense of things for oneself directly, that's his word, directly, and not mediately, not through something else, not through another. But this self-reliance is going to rely on this sort of individual seeking to understand what is true or not true about one's experience and about the world, is reliant on having a kind of faith in a larger order of things. And he will say here, in this essay, he will still use God. He will still use the word God. He will also use other ways to describe this sort of larger force, this larger order in the universe again. So to be self-reliant again isn't to be a self that is in a vacuum screaming, I want, I do anything that I want to, and so on. I have nothing to do with others. It's a kind of self-reliance that relies on a larger self, a larger God, a larger force, and tries to make sense of its own particular self in relation to that larger self or that larger order of things. And again, as he'll say, trying to find one's place within that larger order. So if we look to page 121, where he says exactly that, and we've seen almost exactly these words from him before, 121, the third paragraph, beginning of that paragraph, trust thyself. We've seen him say, his earlier sermon, trust yourself. Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. Accept the place the divine providence has found for you, right? So we're going to work here to figure out what that place is, but then accept it, that providence, right? This larger gift of God, this larger giving. What's the place you've been given? And that's what we need to figure out, all right? So let's go back to the start of the essay here. Oh, I want to say before I go on, I think this essay kind of ends on a thump. I mean, often Emerson's essays end with a great sort of sense of triumph or urging or exhortation to go out into the world. And I actually have always felt that self-reliance kind of ends as if it's kind of still in the middle of thinking. And so I'm not actually going to talk much about it. I think it sort of unwinds rather than really explicitly ends. And I think the great sections are prior to the points 1 through 4, actually, although there's some really interesting things that he says in those points. So if we go to the opening of Self-Reliance, the first line, I'm actually going to read this entire first paragraph, which I think is pretty amazing. And I just want you to note a couple of things. Well, no, I'll read it first and we'll go through it. So pay attention or look for the kind of Emerson that we've seen in other lectures and sermons. So I read the other day some verses written by an eminent painter, which were original and not conventional. The soul always hears an admonition in such lines, let the subject be what it may. The sentiment they instill is of more value than any thought they may contain. To believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius. Speak your latent conviction, and it shall be the universal sense. For the inmost in due time becomes the outmost, and our first thought is rendered back to us by the trumpets of the last judgment. Familiar as the voice of the mind is to each, the highest merit we ascribe to Moses, Plato, and Milton is that they set at naught books and traditions and spoke not what men, but what they thought. A man should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across his mind from within, more than the luster of the firmament of bards and sages. Yet he dismisses without notice his thought, because it is his. In every work of genius we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty. Great works of art have no more affecting lesson for us than this. They teach us to abide by our spontaneous impression with good-humored inflexibility, then most when the whole cry of voices is on the other side. Else tomorrow a stranger will say with masterly good sense precisely what we have thought and felt all the time, and we shall be forced to take with shame our opinion from another. All right, so this essay about self-reliance opens with Emerson involved in the words of someone else, right? Perfect beginning, right? He's looking at something else. He's engaged with something outside of himself that's not actually his own. And he's going to be inspired by it, right? As we saw in The American Scholar. But what is he bringing to his experience of reading these verses written by another? He's bringing himself. He's bringing his full thinking to this sort of active soul, as he says elsewhere, to the reading of these verses. Because look what he does. He processes it. He sees in these words his own ideas. I read the other day some verses by an eminent painter which were original and not conventional. So original here he means, coming from that particular person. They seem to be original to that person. They seem to have come directly from him, all right, rather than this person quoting someone else or simply borrowing, right, simply imitating. The soul always hears an admonition. So the soul says, this soul who's thinking, right, hears an admonition, a warning, right, and feels this sentiment, right, that tells him or makes him feel that he must believe his own thought. And, moreover, believe that what is true for you in your private heart, in his private heart, is true for all. So there's the limit on the selfishness of what could be considered a kind of rampant, self-concerned individualism. The limit is that what you believe is true for you must also be true for all, right? So you have to, it's not telling other people what to do, but it has to be something that you think could be said of everybody or should be said of everybody. So this is a way of limiting selfishness, you could say, and not encouraging it, right? So if I want to I want to build a house on a cliff in California, and I know that that cliff's due to fall or become eroded over the next 5 years, or dangers or something like that, um, I can, you know, I can do that and so on. But if I believe that everybody should be able to do that, then I would be causing the sort of collapse of all of these, edifices over this cliff, right? This is kind of a lame example, I'm realizing now as I say it, but, if everybody wants, let's say, everybody wants to be a gazillionaire. Well, that's literally not possible. We can't. There aren't enough resources in the world, right? So there's a kind of, I'm putting this in kind of material terms, but there's a limit to what we can say is true for ourselves. It is that it must be true for all right? So he says, then speak your latent conviction. So you've got this conviction, but it's latent. It's not yet spoken. It's not yet sort of articulate. You haven't articulated it for yourself yet. And it shall be the universal sense. It will be able to speak for all. For the inmost in due time becomes the outmost. Now, if you're doing this properly somehow, right? If you're really looking to what you believe, you have a sense that something is true, and then you want to test it. You want to see if it's true for all. You want to try to see if you can think about it as being applicable to all. That's how the inmost becomes kind of, in a sense, the outmost. That sense, and then that sense that then the fact that you're also speaking it, right? So he says that Moses, Plato, Milton, these prophets and thinkers and writers set aside books and traditions, right? And tried to speak not what others said, but what they thought. So you need to learn to detect and watch the gleam of light that flashes across your mind from within. And you know that feeling. You have a sort of moment of insight, as he'll say. And there it is. And what he's disappointed in is that we will too quickly dismiss that, right? He dismisses without notice his thought simply because it's his. We doubt ourselves, right? So in every work of genius, in every work that is original in this sense, as he's described it in the opening sentences, we'll recognize our rejected thoughts. We'll recognize, hey, I had an idea like that, but I said it couldn't be, right? I dismissed it simply because it was mine, because I didn't have enough trust in myself, as he would say, or confidence in myself to claim that idea. All right, they come back to us, and that's why they come back with an alienated majesty. They're sort of regal, but they're not our own. They feel like, someone took our idea. And you know that feeling when you look at something that reminds you of something that you wanted to develop, or you may have thought, or had put together in some way. So these great works, right? They teach us this lesson. What is that? They teach us to abide by our spontaneous impression. So we have an impression. It says something to us. It tells us, abide by that, right? But the rest of this essay will tell us, don't simply claim it, but look at it, think about it, put it to the test, right? See what it has to say about how you think about the world, if it can apply to all. So there's the idea of working to find out whether your spontaneous insight is actually the product of just simple desire or whims or pleasures, or if it's actually the sort of sentiment, the feeling that something is true about the universe, about the order of things, that can be said to be true for all. And there's again that test on the rampant selfishness of this idea. So how do we do all that? Seems really vague. And again, he's outlining a kind of way of thinking about ourselves in relation to others that does not have here any other particular example except for the one of the active soul here thinking as he sees reads these words of another. So he's ready now to go back out into the world. All right. So we need to trust ourselves, accept the place that providence has found for us, and so on. All right, so let's look now to see what he says this active thinker, this self-reliant being, starting with him or herself, or at least acknowledging his or her own spontaneous insights into the world, into others, into the words of others, and so on. How that active soul is supposed to actually kind of live a life among others. how is that active soul supposed to be in society, right? When not alone. So remember, not truly alone reading the words of another, but now actually out there in a society with real live beings around. So if we go to page 122, I'm going to read the third paragraph. These are the voices which we hear in solitude, right? This sort of charge to be yourself, to rely on your own spontaneous impressions. But they grow faint and inaudible as we enter into the world, right? As others come into play. Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. Society is a joint stock company in which the members agree for the better securing of his bread to each shareholder to surrender the liberty and culture of the eater. Their virtue and most request is conformity. Self-reliance is its aversion. It loves not realities and creators, but names and customs. Okay, so these names and customs are bad things. Realities and creators are good things. And what he means by this is all very idealized, right? But it's practical and realistic in the sense that, when we do go out among others, it's harder to maintain one's own, the voice that you hear in solitude, the sort of absolute trust in your own idea. And as you see, in some ways, the challenges to it and the impossibility of living it or expressing it or making it visible in some sort of particular act, right? So society, sort of by definition, is a conspiracy against the manhood, against the self-reliance of each one of its members. So we have, if you look to the next paragraph, whoso would be a man would be a nonconformist. And these are some of his strongest statements on nonconforming, right? But he makes it seem as if it's impossible ever to be like anybody, or that the goal is to never be like anybody else ever, anywhere. And of course, I mean, that's extreme. And he is throughout this essay, of course, dealing with the thoughts of others and interacting with long traditions and so on. So he himself knows that this is not true, but again, this is a really strong rhetorical pitch he's making here to try to wake people from their slumber of being simply conformist, completely timid, completely afraid to have their own ideas. And I think this is really, true. I mean, this is idealizing and so on. It would be nice to believe that we're all having our own ideas all the time and claiming them and trying to put them into action. But I think it's true to say that when you go out into the world, we do feel that there's this incredible pressure on us to say certain things rather than other things, to behave in certain ways rather than other ways. And we've all experienced this, so in a certain sense, it's very practical. So he says, whoso would be a man would be a nonconformist, back toward the bottom of 122. He who would gather immortal palms must not be hindered by the name of goodness, but must explore if it be goodness. Now there's the point following up on the end of the previous paragraph. So the names and the customs. We don't want to rely on what others have to say us on say to us on what's conventional, right? What's standard knowledge. We want to discover for ourselves if we accept that knowledge, if we accept it as true. So in this sense, good. So something could be claimed to be good, but he says, no, you need to explore if it be goodness. So don't be hindered by the name of goodness, right? An example is, I don't know if you've met people like this, but I'm always very suspicious when someone tells me that he or she is a good person, right? Who says that? Who says I'm a good person? I'm just immediately suspicious. We're human. I think we do the best we can, but to be so sure that someone is good, there's a kind of, I think, need to attach oneself to that word, to that name, right? To have to imagine oneself in one way, rather than to be exploring what is good and what is not according to one's own judgment, right? And according to particular cases, as he'll say here. So he continues, nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. That really is for Emerson. It all goes back to your mind, your thinking, you thinking for yourself directly. That's integrity. That's what we all, he says, have a duty to do, to use our minds. Absolve you to yourself, and so on. So I'm going to skip down to the last 3 lines on this page to fully explain what he's saying here, and then we're moving into this long paragraph, which is pretty famous. Good and bad, 3 lines up from the bottom of 122. Good and bad are but names very readily transferable to this or that, right? Something could be good here and then bad the next day. So this is an extreme example, but the South, I'm generalizing, but many in the pre-Civil War South would say that slavery is good, and now I think we generally know, I would hope, that it's bad. But these names are transferable. There's the point. And there are less extreme examples, of course. Something could be good or bad, like corporal punishment, spanking your children or disciplining them with physical punishment used not to be such a horrible thing, right? And I'm not talking about severe child abuse, but, just that would be part of the punishment. And now I think it's generally regarded to be unacceptable. So the terms change here. Good and bad are names that are transferable. The only right, he says, is what is after my constitution, and the only wrong was what is against it. Okay, so you must decide for himself. This doesn't seem right to me, or this doesn't seem wrong to me. All right, so a wrong example, killing your mother might be considered a bad thing, but what about it when it's in a case of euthanasia, right? So good and bad are transferable, and we need to explore, again, as he says. You explore it for yourself. You decide. So you can it's not a doing away of standards, as he says. If just hang on, stay on 122, but look ahead to page 131. So hang on to 122. 131, second paragraph, right at the beginning, he's explaining he's not doing away with standards. He's only doing away with popular standards, with group standards, right? So you make your own judgments. You decide what is right and wrong, but you decide it. He says the populists think that your rejection of popular standards, popular standards, the larger group, the majority, right, is a rejection of all standard and mere antinomianism. So there's a suggestion that if you reject the group's definition of right and wrong, that you therefore have no standards, right? And this is what we'll hear sometimes in political debates. Sometimes the far right will say, there's a right and a wrong, and that's all there is to it. And then sometimes really far on the other side, on the far liberal side, there will be the claim that everything's relative. And sometimes that claim gets represented as being an absence of all standards. And Emerson is not interested in sort of any of that, right? And I'm oversimplifying a bit, but he'll say, this isn't just, I gotta be me stuff again. It's not mere antinomianism. It's not merely, I have no standards and I'm just going to, reject all right and wrong. Instead, he's saying that, it's not mere sensualist. It's not simply to fulfill your pleasures and so on. He says you fulfill your round of duties by clearing yourself in the direct or in the reflex way. And of course, he wants the direct way. The reflex way is just sort of, there's a standard and it comes up in a popular standard, it hits you and you reflex and you say, okay, fine, right? I'll follow it. You're sort of just reacting, right? He wants you to be directly claiming and finding your own, making your own judgments. I have my own stern claims and perfect circle, right? So you don't simply react to the standards of others, you create your own, right? So you don't simply reject popular standards because they're popular, nor do you accept them because they're popular. You have nothing to do with them. You decide for yourself what is right and wrong, okay? But you do decide. So there's no sort of, hey, it's all like whatever, man. There's none of that. There is absolutely something that's right or wrong. There isn't absolutely an order in the universe. We may not be always sure that we've found it or sure of what it is, but we need constantly to believe that there is an order and to keep trying to figure out our place within that and what's right and wrong in a particular case according to our own judgment. Now, not, again, our own knee-jerk reaction or our own sort of, emotional response, but our own thoughtful careful response, paying attention. So, and again, I want to say all of this is very idealized, right? I mean, how do we know that we're doing that well? How do we know? These are all really good questions and issues to raise. So right now, he's simply trying to get us away from the crowd, right? Away from relying on the standards of others. So if we go back to, there's so many great lines in this, but here he gives us a really famous example that's pretty controversial, and he's been beat up furiously for this. And I think it's a really strong and really brave example, actually. And this is at the bottom of page 22. He begins. He's just told us that you have to decide for yourself what's right and wrong and not follow what others tell you. And he uses the example of charity work, or a certain kind of charity work, to explain what he means. And again, he's been really taken to task for this. And in some ways, I think unfairly, but there are sort of logical consequences to what he's saying that we need to think about. So he says, a man is to carry himself in the presence of all opposition as if everything were titular and ephemeral but he. So names change, what's good and bad changes, things change, but he's solid, right? The thinking active soul is unchangeable. Or that is to say, he is going to be the sort of stable force in this changing world. I am ashamed to think how easily we capitulate to badges and names, to large societies and dead institutions. The first time I went to Harvard, I had this fellowship at the library. I was so excited, I can't even tell you, and it was totally amazing, right? First time I got to read Emerson's manuscripts and so on, and there is this sense. I mean, you go up and you go, it's Harvard, right? It was really kind of bone chilling, especially for someone who was not a part of this academic world, who didn't know much about it. And so there's a kind of, reverence that's kind of nice about that, but that we can capitulate too easily, right? We can, a sort of rightful respect can turn into an over-reliance or a total capitulation, a sort of slavishness to these societies and institutions and so on, a badge, a name, being way too impressed, right, without making one's own judgment. Every decent and well-spoken individual affects and sways me more than is right. So he's not talking about someone with a necessary title, although someone with a title could speak well and decently, but anyone can. And here's that democratizing impulse again in Emerson. So everyone, no matter what class, color, so on, everyone has the capacity to speak well and decently, right? Whether he lived up to this all the time is a different matter, but this is the ideal, and he really wants to believe that everybody has a right to speak, and should speak if speaking honestly and making one's own decisions. I ought to go upright and vital and speak the rude truth in all ways. Truth can be difficult, right? Truth is not always easy to hear. If malice and vanity wear the coat of philanthropy, shall that pass? Now here's his really, really provocative example. Malice and vanity wear the coat of philanthropy, right? So if someone who's philanthropic, who's trying to help others, right, raising money for others, doing charity work and everything, is doing it only for vain reasons, right? Only to be able to say, I'm a good person, shall that pass, he asks, right? No, he's going to say. He's going to say that's crap, basically, right? If you're doing it. So he doesn't, in other words, the ends don't justify the means for Emerson. We have to always be, or try to be, a person of good character, right? Without, of strong character, by which he means making our own decisions, without performing actions so that we will be good, or so that we can think of ourselves as good. It cannot be vain. If an angry bigot, here's how he's going to explain the malice, an angry bigot assumes this bountiful cause of abolition, right, and comes to me with his last news from Barbados. So if his neighbor, an angry bigot, right, sort of a racist, comes to him and says, I want to help to abolish slavery in the West Indies, right? You've got a note down there, in 1834, right? I'm interested in this cause that's very, very far away from me, right? And he knows that this is actually an angry bigot of some kind. Why should I not say to him, go love thy infant, thy, your own, right? Love thy woodchopper. Be good-natured and modest. Have that grace. Never varnish your hard, uncharitable ambition with this incredible tenderness for black folk 1,000 miles off. Thy love afar is spite at home. That's a fantastic line, right? And he says basically like, yeah, how easy. You're loving an abstraction. You're supporting a cause that you've heard about secondhand, that you haven't seen, that you haven't experienced. And how easy, how nice for you, right? Whereas at home, you don't love your own infant, you don't love your own good wood chopper, you're not modest, you're not a good person in your own community. But it's easy, therefore, oh, how nice for you to imagine that you're a good person because you care about folks far away whom you've never met and about which you know very little other than any of secondhand. So rough and graceless would be such greeting. He says, he knows he shouldn't speak this way, but truth, he says, is handsomer than the affectation of love. So Emerson's not going to say, oh, isn't that lovely of you? He's going to say, oh, yeah? Well, you're hateful toward your own community and your own family. Why don't you go take care of them? Your goodness must have some edge to it, else it is none, right? To be good is also to be willing to speak the truth, right? Which can be difficult. The doctrine of hatred must be preached as the counteraction of the doctrine of love when that pules and whines. I shun father and mother and wife and brother when my genius calls me. I will write on the lintels of the doorpost whim. Now here he's going into, saying like, look, sometimes I have to reject even what my own family wants from me, even what my own, if my genius calls me, right? If I am having original thoughts, if I have something to say directly of me, I must say whim, I must run off, and so on. He's gotten like beat up for this. He's also gotten praised for this, right? So I hope it is somewhat better than whim at last, but we cannot spend the day in explanation. Expect me not to show cause why I seek or why I exclude company. So sometimes he'll want company, sometimes he will not want it. He has to explain. He doesn't want to explain himself. He just wants us to know that he needs to make his own decisions about when he needs others around and when he does not. Then again, do not tell me, as a good man did today, of my obligation to put all poor men in good situations. Now notice the all poor men, and he responds with, are they my poor? Just as he says to the angry bigot above, are they, go tend to your people, right? My poor. I tell thee, thou foolish philanthropist, that I grudge the dollar, the dime, the cent I give to such men as do not belong to me and to whom I do not belong. So again, he's saying he will not give to an abstraction, right? He will not give to other than those to whom he is committed or that he understands or knows. My poor. Now there's something really honest and wonderful about this. And you can already see, though, the resistance to this as well. There is a kind of complete disregard for anyone that Emerson does not know personally or that is not a kind of type of that he can appreciate or understand. But there is, again, a kind of call for us all to be honest with ourselves and to really take care of our own rather than to ignore our own by simply looking to others far away that don't really require any kind of true or commitment from us that we can talk about, in the abstract and tell ourselves what we're good people because of. So he says there is a class of persons, right? Not all, but there's a class of persons to whom, by all, not social class, but just a type of people, by all spiritual affinity, I am bought and sold. For them I will go to prison if need be, but your miscellaneous popular charities, these popular things, the education at the College of Fools, there's an interesting, there are a lot of social experiments in the 1840s, 30s and 40s. Brook Farm near Emerson, sort of new little utopian societies that were being, the Oneida community, right? The building of meeting houses to the vain end to which many now stand, alms to sots, the thousand-fold relief societies. So sometimes he says, I'll give sometimes the dollar, but it's a wicked dollar, right? So pretty strong claims, but here he's holding himself accountable to the claims that he's made in this essay, that he must decide for himself. And that's where he falls. He will give to his own or to those to whom he has a kind of spiritual, with whom he has a kind of spiritual affinity. He will not give to abstractions, right? To people he doesn't know, to causes he has not experienced, causes for which he has not experienced the troubles himself. And when he gets to 1851 to 1850, later on, when he wouldn't speak about and he wouldn't speak against slavery, or he did in very limited ways, sort of personally, privately, but he wouldn't speak out against slavery until 1851 with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850 in Boston, which he then said brought slavery right onto his own doorstep, because the Fugitive Slave Law required that Emerson and all Northerners partake in the capturing of freed slaves and send them back to the South to their owners. So that would incriminate him, and he is now he is directly affected by slavery rather than indirectly, and so he says then he'll take part in it. A lot to say about that, pro and con and so on, but that's where he stands, and it is a position, right? So, all right, that's almost all I have to say about this, but he wants us to be willing then to constantly be examining and exploring for ourselves what be good and what be bad. But this exploring for ourselves is not, it just seems that way to me. It's trying to decide what is true could be said to be true for all. Again, I realize very kind of vague in a certain sense, where he's trying to sort of outline a conceptual framework or a way that we might kind of work through the world without simply relying or over-relying on social codes, conventions, and so on, right? Without treating them as if they're not changeable, because they are. They do change. So laws change, social institutions change, public opinion changes, and he wants us to be able to kind of somehow try to see through that and see what he says is true, what could actually hold true for all. So laws against slavery were the law of the land. I mean, the law of slavery was the law of the land, and that changed. And it changed partly because, a number of reasons obviously, but partly because, the claim was made that there is a higher law than man's law, right? And this law for Emerson relies on a higher law in the universe, an order to the universe, some sort of essential good that relies on, even as he says here, a God underneath all of that, or a God that puts things in their right places, or creates a world that wants to be good, that has an order to it, if only we humans didn't screw it up all the time. So he wants to remind us then that we need to be constantly exploring and thinking about and making judgments about our own circumstances. And he'll say at the bottom, near the bottom, last paragraph, first line, page 129, life only avails not the having lived. Power ceases in the instant of repose. So we keep continually thinking, which has something to do with these very famous claims he makes on page 125, with which I'll close. So 125, third paragraph, beginning of the third paragraph on 125, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. I love the rhyme there. So not consistency in general, but a foolish consistency, right? Steadfastly holding to a view that you have reason to change, for example. With consistency, a great soul has simply nothing to do. You have to be willing to evaluate the world as you find it, determine your place as you see it, and you need to be willing to change your mind if that is called for according to your examinations. He may as well concern himself with his shadow on the wall. Speak what you think now in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradict everything you say today. Now, this could seem to be a kind of antinomianism again, or a kind of just, saying whatever comes to mind at whatever minute and having no interest in principles and so on. And the point that Emerson is trying to make in this essay is that we need to be aware of when we might be wrong. We need to be constantly searching for what is true, right? What the larger order of the universe might look like and want from us. And we also need to be able to be willing to admit that maybe we weren't right. So there's this idea of this constant seeking, right? So again, abstract claims, and one could take them. You could take them to mean that there's nothing true and we are always changing and so on. I think that oversimplifies it quite a bit, actually. But there is this idea that we need to keep trying to learn. We need to keep examining. We have a duty to do so. And this is the work of thinking, which Emerson is always returning us to, as we know. Okay, so that's the end of self-reliance.